The Alberta Fair Deal Panel report was released yesterday, and it had a number of recommendations. And we're going to talk to Ted Morton, who's the former Alberta Finance Minister and a scholar at the University of Calgary. We're going to talk to him about recommendation 4, and I'll read it for you. It's to collaborate with other jurisdictions and other stakeholders to secure cross-border rights-of-way and create unobstructed corridors within Canada to tidewater and world markets, which sounds awfully like a pipeline corridor and obviously going to be contentious. So welcome to the interview, Ted.
Thank you, Markham.
So give me your response to recommendation number 4.
I was very pleased to see it. It may be, in some respects, the most important recommendation in the entire report. That's hard for me to say because, of course, I've been a long-time advocate of some of the other reforms, the pension reform, policing, collecting our own taxes. But frankly, the Alberta economy was in crisis already before COVID and the OPEC Russian price war. We need access, Alberta needs access to global markets and global prices. And we're into about the 10th year of a campaign to landlock Alberta oil and gas. The anti-pipeline movement, which unfortunately has had an ally in Ottawa since 2015, and it's devastated the Alberta economy. So I think in many respects it's the most important recommendation. It's a lifeline to the future. If there is not competitive access to global markets and global prices in the next decade, Edmonton and Calgary will be like the next Winnipeg, cities that the economy is left behind. So it's critical.
Well, Ted, let me push back on that a little bit because the Trudeau Liberals have approved 2 pipelines, so Trans Mountain expansion and the upgrade of Line 3, and also let the approval of Keystone XL pipeline stand. And those 3 pipelines together total 1.8 million barrels a day of shipping capacity. And according to the Canadian Energy Regulator's latest report, that will do Canada for 20 years. We won't need another pipeline to 2040. So I'm not sure that the argument holds up.
Well, look at the exodus of companies and capital from Western Canada just in the last decade. Over $50 billion of companies sold that evacuated because they've lost confidence. Business is a question of investor confidence. Nobody wants to be in Western Canada anymore because of the lack of competitive access to markets. I think the numbers speak for themselves, and you can say, well, Trudeau's done this, Trudeau's done that. The market's not persuaded, and the result is, again, even before COVID and even before the collapse of oil prices, the Alberta economy was in crisis mode, unemployment, foreclosures, bankruptcies, and so I think that's a critical part of the report. And again, we've seen both British Columbia and Quebec try to use obstructionist tactics on both Energy East and Trans Mountain. Frankly, BC got away with it for 3 years, and Quebec is, and Trans Mountain's still not built. Ottawa may own it, but it's not built yet. And the way they handled the protest over the last February over the new natural gas export plant in BC, they don't look like they have the conviction to stand up for the anti-pipeline. Let's landlock Alberta. So it's critical for Alberta's future.
Well, okay, let's get down to that, because the issue, or what recommendation 4 says, is collaborate with other jurisdictions and other stakeholders to secure cross-border rights of way. Now, that is already granted under the Canadian Constitution Act of 1867, Section 91, subsection 10, clauses A and C, clearly give the federal government the exclusive authority over interprovincial pipelines. It's been tested in the Supreme Court all the way back to 1954. It was upheld again in recent Federal Court of Appeal jurisdictions. and the federal government actually went out and bought a pipeline company in order to get a pipeline built. I don't see how we, if the federal government already has that exclusive jurisdiction, what's to be gained by some agreement between provinces?
Well, it's going to require national leadership as well. And you talked about the sections of Section 91, 9210, projects for the general improvement of Canada. That's another federal power. Section 121, the free flow of goods and services across. This is clearly, completely, 100% in federal jurisdiction. And the fact is that the Trudeau government refused to lift a finger against British Columbia during 3 years of obstruction after the NDP minority government was elected there and promised to use every tool in the toolbox to stop Trans Mountain. They indirectly assisted Quebec in canceling Energy East after over $1 billion was spent. So the lack of action, the legal powers are there, and I think that the Trudeau government, for political reasons, did not want to use those powers. They wanted to keep their majority government depends on lots of seats in Metro Vancouver and 40. I think they got 42 seats out of Quebec in 2015, the most any Liberal candidate got since his father got them in 1980. So this is, to me, this, from my perspective, this is the inaction on pipelines has been very political and very, very harmful to, well, not just harmful to Alberta. As I said, Alberta has no future, Saskatchewan not much better, if there's not competitive access to global markets and global prices in the coming decades. And the proof of that is just the exodus of capital from Western Canada.
But Ted, the evidence doesn't support your argument, because in fact, going back to 2017, the National Energy Board, which is at that time, and now it's the Canadian Energy Regulator, but it exercised the authority of the federal government under the National Energy Board Act, and over and over again, it ruled in favor. In favor of Kinder Morgan against Burnaby, the city of Burnaby, and again against the BC government, and then the federal authority was upheld all the way to the federal court. Well, in different cases, to the Supreme Court and to the Federal Court of Appeal. And I mean, you could argue the federal government did what it should do, which is allow the courts to hear those arguments, and then they ruled in the federal government's favor. It may not have been as expeditious as Alberta would like, but I think the evidence shows that the system essentially worked the way it was supposed to.
Well, I would simply say that it took 3 years for the process to run its course. The whole strategy of the anti-pipeline, landlocked Alberta oil and gas is a death by delay strategy. So the longer it takes, the more people lose confidence and leave. And with respect to Energy East, the NEB, it was when that project collapsed, its advocate walked away when the NEB added yet another requirement, downstream emissions, to halfway through the approval process. So TransCanada said, we've had it, we've left. So, but the federal government has all sorts of levers, direct and indirect, to persuade, I put that in parentheses, recalcitrant provincial governments to let the federal government do what it should do, which is get these corridors built. I think the opportunity here, frankly, is in the current federal Conservative Party leadership. I think this has to be an issue that's discussed there, because again, if Alberta and Saskatchewan don't have competitive access to global markets and global prices in the coming decades, I don't see why we would stay in Canada. Why would you want to stay if you become the next Winnipeg?
Well, okay, let's talk about the collaboration with other jurisdictions and stakeholders, because if you're going to Tidewater in British Columbia, any corridor, any pipeline has to go through unceded territory, and there have been Supreme Court decisions to Delgamuukw and Chilcotin, which recognize Aboriginal title. There are no treaties in BC. So if you're going to negotiate with every First Nation in BC, or the ones that would be affected, to get their consent to this, and given lack of treaties and all the things I just mentioned, it seems to me that you're going to be, that's actually a more cumbersome and lengthy process, and probably unsuccessful, in my opinion, than the current system with the federal government having the authority. So would you respond to that?
Twofold. One, the very decision you referred to recently, the Federal Court of Appeal decision, was very explicit, paragraph, I think, 151 in their decision, that consultation, the duty to consult, is not a veto power, right? Just because you consult and don't get what you want, that doesn't mean Aboriginal groups can therefore veto it. They've made that very clear. And secondly, I think you're seeing increasingly that a younger generation of Aboriginal leaders see the opportunities that resource development means for their communities, and there's more and more not just openness, enthusiasm for becoming part of the creation of resource wealth, and again, with proper environmental impacts and other types of compensation. And I think you've seen both on the industry side and the government side a recognition of that and an opportunity for new cooperation. So again, I think with the right type of leadership, those problems can be addressed.
Okay, explain to me then how you think what's the mechanism? What does that collaboration look like?
Well, here's another good example. The federal government, again, the Trudeau government, should have at a much earlier, and frankly, maybe the Harper government as well, should have tried to, since this is clearly an area of federal jurisdiction and a federal responsibility, create a checklist of what the duty to consult entails, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And they never did that. They just left it in the courts. The courts, every new case, there'd be a new wrinkle, something new. Yeah, you've done a good job, but not good enough. Here's another requirement. This is why, $50 billion worth of companies walked away. They said Canada just doesn't have, there's no system in place in Canada to get the pipelines built that are necessary to get these resources to global markets. So there was an abdication, I would say, a total abdication of responsibility by the Trudeau government for taking the lead on this to be proactive rather than reactive. And again, I think they did it partly because of their commitment to the carbon reduction, the Paris Accord and that, and partly for political reasons. Metro BC and Quebec are critical to their plans for majority governments. And I, for one, and I think an increasing number of Albertans, are not willing to be sacrificed on the political bench of what works politically for the federal Liberal Party.
Well, Ted, I'm going to push back on this one as well, because it's been the case for many governments, including, as you mentioned, the CPC under Stephen Harper. Nobody got Aboriginal consultation right. I think everybody recognizes it. I've interviewed constitutional scholars who have said this is very difficult. It's not, even though the Supreme Court has laid down clear guidelines, the governments have not figured
no clear guidelines at all, really. But we'll agree to disagree on that.
Yeah, fair enough. But anyway, so my sources say that the court has laid down guidelines. The government hasn't figured out how to implement them yet. And so the Trudeau government didn't do a great job on Trans Mountain expansion. But then after the judicial review in the Federal Court of Appeal that was brought by First Nations, they did fix it. And they did get a judgment in favor of the pipeline. And so I'm not sure how that constitutes abdicating responsibility.
So when was the Trans Mountain expansion first proposed? 2009. When did that decision come down? February of 2020. So it's a death by delay strategy, and by dragging their feet, in my view, abdicating their leadership responsibilities, the federal government has either actively or passively been part of this death by delay strategy that has driven out all the capital investment. And again, this is being a bit legalistic, but frankly important. Go read Section 35 of the Constitution Act again. It doesn't talk about the Aboriginal right. It says existing Aboriginal rights. The adjective existing is put in there. there would have been no Section 35. In fact, Section 35 was dropped completely from a draft of the Constitution Act during the negotiations in 1980, because Peter Lougheed, the Alberta Premier, said, nobody knows what this means. We don't want a blank check for this to go to the courts, and who knows what they'll do with it. So the only reason there is a Section 35 is because the adjective existing is placed, it's existing Aboriginal rights are what are protected. And there was no mandate in there for the federal government to go and for the courts to create new rights. Does the duty to consult, do those terms appear in Section 35? No. Does the honor of the Crown appear in Section 35? No. That's all that's judge-made law. And
well, look,
but we got 30 years of it now, so we have to deal with it. But from an Alberta perspective, Peter Lougheed saw this as a problem back in 1981. He had a solution to it, and surprise, surprise, the courts ignored that and erased that limitation.
Let me bring in another Canadian Energy Research Institute study, which came out earlier this year, and it compared regulatory regimes for natural gas pipelines and oil pipelines to the U.S. And what it found is that it takes 13 months longer in Canada to get approval for a gas pipeline, 19 months for an oil pipeline, and the difference between the U.S. and Canada is essentially Aboriginal rights. It's Section 30, Section 35. But other than those things, the processes take about the same length of time because the Americans have the National Energy Protection Act, and that slows things down just like the Canada's Environmental Review Act. So in fact, Canada and the US have essentially the same system or come to the same outcomes. We're just longer because we have more protections for Aboriginals in the Constitution. I don't know how you get around that.
Well, you get around it by having a clear, explicit list of things that have to be done to meet the duty to consult. The courts have never done that. And the opportunity, again, the federal government could have legislated on that and said, okay, here's what, but there's so much ambiguity, so much lack of clarity of what the duty to consult and the honor of the Crown is, that you've had appeal after appeal after appeal. As I said, Trans Mountain was proposed in 2009, and the court decision that we both referred to, February of 2020, that's 11 years later. And again, global capital has just walked away from Western Canada. And in terms of I saw the figure just this past week, in the first 4 years, from 2015 to 2019, capital expenditure in energy in Western Canada dropped by more than 50%, and in the US it was up by 40%. So the very same companies that are doing, and these are Canadian companies as well, doing business on both sides of the border, they stopped spending money in Alberta and Saskatchewan because of no pipeline access and the lack of any sign that the federal government saw this as a priority.
Okay, Ted, but you're talking about 2014 being the height of the oil sands construction capital expenditures. It was $86 billion. Then we had the price collapse in 2015 and 2016. And the oil sands companies very clearly, they said this: we're not going to be doing any more greenfield, which is the construction from scratch. We're going to do brownfield, which is much cheaper, much quicker to oil, and it will. And we're going to use the infrastructure we've already built, and that changed the amount of capital that was required to do oil sands projects. Therefore, oil sands capex came down significantly. I mean, it has all kinds of things to do with global markets and with corporate decisions around how they want to employ capital, and a whole lot less about, the issues that you brought up. So I'm not sure that you can make a credible argument around that because there are other reasons why capital expenditures fell.
Well, I think money talks, and all the money's gone south, including, look at all the Canadian companies that have either moved their offices or moved their operations to Denver and Houston. We're going to have to agree to disagree on that as well, I think.
Well, Ted, thank you very much for this. It's always a pleasure to talk to you because we usually agree to disagree on these kinds of things, but it's always fun to have an airing of differing opinions. So thank you, and we'll look forward to doing this again.
Okay, thank you.